Okay, here we go. I don't need that. I'll drop this for now. And here it is. Okay, so remember the key question that we've been talking about is death and whether death is a misfortune for its victim. We know that Bradley, he has a theory, the deprivation theory, the badness of death for the person who dies or for the individual who dies, more generally, because he does apply it to non-human animals. So this is just all recapping just to get us rethinking about the material. And then we discussed three challenges to the deprivation theory, the badness of death last time, DTBD, the ambiguity problem, the all deprivations are a misfortune problem, and the desires problem. And we were about to segue to the psychological connectedness problem before we cut out. So maybe I'll see if there are any questions or clarifications needed about any of these problems that we could do before we continue on. So anybody have a question or comment or clarification about the ambiguity problem? Maybe we'll start there. If you're feeling good with that, then the not all deprivations are misfortune problem. I think there's maybe one thing I'll add here that I made some changes on the PowerPoint presentation just to make things a little bit clearer in case they weren't in my initial discussion. So recall that DTBD, the deprivation theory, the badness of death, relies on deprivations being misfortunes. But then there are cases, I called them counterexamples last time, but just cases that count against deprivations being misfortunes would be being deprived of Aladdin's lamp, being deprived of winning the lottery. Okay, these seem to be deprivations, but they don't seem to be misfortunes. It's not a misfortune to you that you never got Aladdin's lamp or that you never won the lottery. So then this leads some to say, well, we can understand deprivations as misfortunes in the following way, so as to avoid problematic cases like the case of Aladdin's lamp and the cases of winning the lottery, of not winning the lottery. Person P suffers the misfortune of not acquiring X only if P could reasonably expect to have acquired X. And then, of course, when they don't acquire X, despite the fact that it was reasonable for them to expect it, then we say it was a misfortune that they didn't get the relevant object. Okay. So maybe last time I went through this a little too quickly, so it might be helpful to think of an example here. So I think I was just thinking really of the negative case as opposed to maybe more positive cases, and that could have been a bit confusing. So suppose that someone gives us to share, a delicious cake or something, or a tray of cupcakes or something. I don't know. I really like cupcakes, so let's use that as our example. So someone comes in and says, "Hey, here's some cupcakes for you and your class to enjoy. You've been such a good class, good teacher, good students. Here's some cupcakes, and they're for us to share with each other." And so, the trays sort of brought up to the teacher's table, and the thought would be that I would distribute them accordingly or have everyone come up to enjoy them. But suppose that once the person who brought the cupcakes in leaves, I take the tray and I dash from my office. I lock myself in my office and I eat all of the cupcakes, or at least keep them all to myself. Don't eat them all in one setting so I don't get sick and all the rest. So I say that in that case, right? I've deprived you of something. I've deprived you of the cupcake or the cupcakes that you would have enjoyed. But the deprivation is also a misfortune, right? to you, because you could reasonably expect to have acquired one of the cupcakes. You could have reasonably acquired to get one of them, given that, right, they were for all of us to enjoy, not just for me to enjoy. So we'd say that, you suffered the misfortune of not acquiring or not getting a cupcake, right? In the case that was developed, call it the cupcake case if you want, right? Only if, right, so it's a necessary condition, only if you could reasonably expect to have acquired the cupcake, to have gotten the cupcake in the first place. So that'd be like a positive case that supports this possible revision. Okay. Or possible account of providing a necessary condition for something counting as a misfortune. So then we have an account of deprivation that gives us, right, an account of the relevant misfortune. So that way then we can apply to the deprivation theory, the badness of death, or the relevant sense of deprivation, the sense that involves this like condition of a reasonable acquisition, or a reasonable expectation for an acquisition. Okay, hopefully that clarifies things a little bit there with the positive case. And then we went through this last time. Remember, we talked about how Bradley, he offers a challenge to this necessary condition for something counting as a misfortune by giving us a case of someone who can't reasonably expect to have acquired a cure for cancer, but it's still a misfortune that they didn't get it. They didn't get the cure for cancer. That seems to be pretty clear. Bradley's taking that to be pretty clear. The upshot is something that I don't know if I drove home clear well enough last time. So the upshot would be the upshot that Bradley provides us in his paper. It's unclear how to revise the deprivation account to avoid cases like Aladdin's lamp, the case of the lottery, etc., counting as deprivations. And he leaves it at that. So there might be ways of doing so, but it wasn't based on what was offered. And Bradley's strategic, he considers a view that's been developed in the literature and just shows that it doesn't work with the counterexample here. You can call this the cancer case if you wanted to, or the cure for cancer case. Doesn't work. And so how to proceed from there. So that way we can be sure that the deprivations in our theory, the deprivation, in our theory of the deprivation theory, the badness of death, right, doesn't end up having an account of deprivation that's consistent with someone not getting Aladdin's lamp or someone not winning the lottery counting as deprivations. Okay. Hopefully that's significant. We have a deprivation theory, the badness of death. You want to have the right account of deprivation in the theory. Now this is sort of a little sidebar that I don't have on slides here that's maybe worth mentioning. It might just be worthwhile to say that that we need to make a distinction between preventions on the one hand and deprivations on the other. Or perhaps what we do is we develop this notion of a prevention and say that that's the more general concept, and then not all preventions are going to count as deprivations. So you might be prevented from getting Aladdin's lamp, right? Because the laws of nature, right, prevent you from ever getting such a, like, that's just a fantastical, it goes against the laws of nature that there be such a thing in the first place. And you might be prevented from winning the lottery just because the odds are so significantly against ever winning the lottery. But it might be a stretch to say that those count as deprivations in the first place. Right. So Bradley seems like he's open to saying that not getting Aladdin's lamp and not winning the lottery, those are deprivations. But there might be like a case to be made that we just need to do some conceptual work here. And that can help fix some of the problems here, right? And thinking about the not all deprivations are a misfortune problem. So you develop a concept of prevention that's general, and then you include under the concept of preventions the concept of deprivation. So you can have preventions which are deprivations, but not all preventions need to be deprivations. Some preventions can be non-deprivations. You might have a better tag for this category of preventions, but we could just call them non-deprivations if you want, right? Maybe just call them mere preventions, just to give them a tag. And you might think that we're just kind of splitting hairs here a little bit, but I don't think so, because I think that we're tracking something that corresponds with how we ordinarily think of things. So to use the cupcake example, so I was trying to be a little bit strategic in using the cupcake example a moment ago because it's going to come up again. The case where someone comes and brings us a tray of cupcakes to share, and the case where I steal the entire tray and enjoy them all to myself. That seems to be a case where I prevented you from the cupcakes. I prevented you from enjoying the cupcakes, and I've also deprived you of the enjoyment of the cupcakes, right? It seems pretty clear, doesn't it? But now imagine a case where instead of someone bringing in an entire tray of cupcakes for us to enjoy, instead they brought in a single cupcake, and it's for me. So we're sitting there in class, someone walks in and says, "Hey, you did a good job teaching this week." So they hand me a cupcake, and it's a really small cupcake. Okay, cupcakes are already pretty small, but imagine it's like really small, bite-sized or something like that. And let's just suppose that you want it, or you want some of it. And so you come up to try to take it from you. I may prevent you from it. I ward you off, and I pop it into my mouth and I eat it real fast. See, you can't have it now, right? Because I'm done. I ate it already. In that case, I prevented you from the cupcake that was, remember, given to me, yours truly. But I don't think we'd want to say I deprived you of anything in that case. It'd be a stretch to say you deprived me of that cupcake. You deprived me of part of that cupcake. I mean, it was a really small cupcake after all. But really, more to the point, it was my cupcake. It was given to me. So I haven't deprived you of anything. I think we'd be inclined to say that. I'm guessing. I think I'm assuming. I think that's a very natural thing to say. So we have a case of prevention without deprivation. But you can have preventions that are cases of deprivation. So there just might be conceptual fixes here that Bradley can help himself to. I don't know why he wouldn't, but there's at least that conceptual work that could be done. And I say it's not a case of splitting hairs. I do think it is tracking something that is quite ordinary in our thinking about things. So I take it that when philosophers or others split hairs, they're making distinctions where no such distinctions really exist, or they're saying that there's distinctions or differences without distinctions or some such, right? Without there being actual differences in the world or something. I don't think that that's going on here based on these two different examples. They could be multiplied really, over and over again if we wanted to display their generality. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense and the upshot is clear, because I don't think I drove home the upshot when I was discussing this objection or this problem last time. Okay, so then there's the desires problem. So remember with this one, in case it wasn't entirely clear, here the goal was to say, look, DTBD is too general. We need to develop a theory of the badness of death, which restricts the relevant candidates for death, um, or restricts the candidates for whom death is bad. And um, according to the desires problem, what we need to do is we need to consider only those individuals that have robust desires. That might be a way of initially thinking about it. And the relevant robust desire that Bradley discusses, at least in the paper I had you read, is this desire for continued existence or having a desire to live. And so the response that Bradley gives to this is to just give us some cases. So the Tuan case. So the Tuan case is mine, but it's just to flesh out Bradley's response to the desires problem. So remember, Tuan desires to continue living, but so then the condition that the condition of having the robust desires in place, according to the desires problem. But then according to the Tuan case that I've developed, his future promise is much more badness than goodness. So in terms of well-being, you're going to see that if we were to chart it, it'd be in the negatives, you could say. So the DTBD is going to predict that death isn't bad for Tuan because his future doesn't promise more, goodness than badness. It promises more badness than goodness. Again, remember, in terms of well-being levels, the well-being levels that Tuan would have. But that's the wrong result according to this objection, because it seems like it would be bad for Tuan to die, given that he desires to continue living. And then B, if Tuan is killed, DTBD struggles to account for the wrongness of killing. So there was that related issue, given that there's at least a rough connection between death being bad for the individual who dies and it being wrong to kill, right? The individual who's killed. Okay. So at least in some cases, we can appeal to, and maybe a wide range of cases, we're going to appeal to the fact that what made it wrong to kill someone is the fact that they were deprived of the good future that they would have had. So if we're going to be just a generic DTBD theorist and we consider Tuan, whose future promise is more badness than goodness, then presumably when it comes to our theory of the wrongness of killing, we're going to also develop a deprivation theory, right? It looks like we're going to have a hard time accounting for the wrongness of killing Tuan, given that he wasn't deprived of a valuable future. Killing Tuan didn't or wouldn't deprive him of a valuable future. Okay. We saw what Bradley's replies were, digs in his heels and says that death is not bad for Tuan. Okay, and then he thinks that a DTBD theorist can account for the wrongness of killing Tuan without, or just by claiming that when Tuan's killed, he wasn't harmed. There's some other explanation that's going to account for killing Tuan. So he doesn't give us possibilities here, but just on the side, you could just imagine someone who has like a DTWK view, a deprivation theory of the wrongness of killing view, who thinks that that it might be true across a range of cases that what makes it wrong to kill Tuan or wrong to kill individuals is the fact that they're deprived of valuable futures, valuable futures that they would have had were they not killed. But they could also say things like there are other explanations in the neighborhood or other explanations that can account for the wrongness of killing, like it violates someone's rights or some other claim like that, or some even would appeal to the fact that Tuan's loved ones would be deprived in various ways. So those are a couple different routes that one could go. There are definitely others. But Bradley just wants to just claim that we can have cases of harmless killing. So Tuan's not harmed by being killed because it wasn't bad for him to have been killed. It wasn't bad for him to have died. Okay. And then what Bradley wants to do is really take on the robust condition that the desires objection poses for DTBD in the first place. Basically, you wanted to claim that it's just too strong because you can imagine someone who fails to desire living, someone who fails to have desires for continued existence, etc. Like Tuan, who's depressed about 2020, as we talked about last time. Tuan's just mistaken about how his future is going to go. So his depression leads him to form false beliefs about how well his future is going to go for him. And even though the desires condition isn't satisfied, the robust desires condition isn't satisfied, Bradley wants to say that Tuan's death is bad for him. He claims that it's quite intuitive that it's bad for him. So some final remarks on the desires problem here, at least for now. This is a problem that's pervasive in the literature on the badness of death. So we'll talk more about it when we get to a discussion of Bradley's view on whether or not death is bad for cows, for example, what we'll conclude with today. So the desires problem presupposes the desire theory of well-being. Right, that's contentious. So a desire theory of well-being, remember, is one that has it that what fundamentally is good for us in terms of our well-being is having our desire satisfied. And this, desire theories of well-being have the problems of bad or pointless desires. There are other problems as well, but those are just a couple that are worth reminding, or just worth mentioning because we talked about them before. Two, some develop desire theories for the sake of justifying meat eating practices. So they want to exclude animals as being candidates for whom death can be bad. And Bradley, he just notes this in his paper. Sometimes people develop desire theories and will then use our desire theory to qualify theories of the badness of death for the individual that dies, right, so as to preclude death being bad for animals. And then as soon as it's argued that death isn't bad for animals, some will take a short hop, skip, and a jump to the conclusion that killing animals isn't wrong. You see? So if killing animals isn't wrong, then from there, then we could raise and kill animals for food. They'd be morally justifiable. And then three, it's implausible though that animals lack robust desires. So some, again, will develop their desire theory, their desire satisfaction theory of well-being. They'll use it to restrict the candidates for whom death could be bad. And but then one kind of reply is to say that animals are going to satisfy the desire condition, so they didn't really succeed in precluding animals from being candidates for whom death could be bad, because animals can have like the desire to continue living, the desire for life itself. I mean, it might be not as robust as our desires for such things, but doesn't mean that animals don't have such desires, even implicitly. And then lastly, one could bite the bullet here. Um, Even if animals lack such desires, so they don't have the robust desires that the desires the earth wants to maintain, is necessary for a deprivation theory, the badness of death, or for just any theory of the badness of death for the individual that dies, well, then babies would lack such robust desires as well. And it may not be totally clear, but these implications are theoretically disastrous, aren't they? Because then death isn't bad for a baby, but of course, death can be bad for a baby. Of course, it'd be even more theoretically disastrous if we made similar moves from the move that death isn't bad for a baby to killing a baby isn't wrong. Okay, and some that I know go that route. Um, there are colleagues of mine who, I mean, at Cal Poly in the philosophy department, who have told me such things explicitly. I won't name any names, so they don't get any hate mail or anything like that. But they bite the bullet and say, "Yeah, killing. They say death isn't bad for babies, and um, um, when babies are killed, they're not the victims. They're not the moral victims." Now, they didn't pull out a loudspeaker and start shouting these views out. They weren't stated to me in any kind of confidence either. But yeah, but just recently, a colleague of mine maintained that what would make killing a baby wrong is not that the baby is the victim, right, of the killing, but rather the baby's parents or loved ones more generally. They're the victims. So some think that that's just sort of like, if a view of the badness of death, which has implications for potentially for a view of the wrongness of killing, has those implications, then whatever view was developed can just be chucked, right? That's oftentimes what philosophers would say in response to someone who said such a thing. Even non-philosophers would say such a thing. So shortly after I had that conversation, so this is a little anecdotal point here that I'll make, and then I'll shut up about it. But I went to um, an administrative assistant who I'm friends with, and I know she has children, small children. She had a baby, I think, just a year or so ago at the time. And I didn't name any names. I just went to her and said, "Hey, what would you say if a philosopher here in this very department said that that if your baby were killed, right? God forbid, right? If your baby were killed, that your baby wouldn't be a victim, a moral victim of it." And she just she got pretty upset. She's like, "I can't even handle thinking about that." I think I began by asking her, "Do you think that your baby would be a victim if your baby were killed?" And she was like, "Of course." I'd be like, "Well, what explains that?" She says, "Well, my baby would be killed, right?" It was like obvious. And then I went on to ask the sort of the longer question, and didn't name any names, which philosophy professor had said that, and she just said that she couldn't really handle it. It was really irksome that someone would think that her baby couldn't be a moral victim of killing if the baby were killed. Maybe that's a biased kind of answer, but still, I do think it tracks just common sense thinking. Of course, babies can be victims of killing. So that's just to sort of flesh out some of the potentially disastrous theoretical implications with having some like robust desires condition for the badness of death for the individual that dies. Okay. All right, so we're ready to talk about the psychological connectedness problem. So let's see if we can make sense of this. This is similar to the desires problem in the sense that according to this objection to DTBD, DTBD is, it's too general, and so it needs to be properly qualified. We need to restrict the relevant candidates for whom death can be bad. So on this view, instead of giving some desires condition, we're given a condition involving psychological connectedness. And Jeff McMahon, he's the relevant philosopher that's that Bradley takes aim at. So just quickly here, here's a paper from 2008 from Bradley, which he cites. I was checking out earlier. Just wanted to share it with you in case you're interested. You just go to the if you just did a Google search for Bradley, you go to his webpage, and he generously posts his philosophy papers on it. But the worst time to die is where he takes on McMahon specifically. So just in case you were curious. So so just number 2 here, candidates for being a victim of death must have robust, and here's a fancy word, diachronic psychological connectedness. And so what diachronic just means is across time, as opposed to just at a specific time or at a time. We were talking about across time. So when you think about the chronic here, we're talking about time, and then dia just means across time. Synchronic is the contrast concept. Synchronic just means at a time. So again, those individuals for whom death can be bad are those that have robust psychological connections across time. So it's not a claim about desires had by the relevant individual being robust or robust enough. And so we have perhaps our DTBD theory. We have our deprivation theory. So death is bad for the individual that dies. If and only if the individual if the death deprives the individual of a valuable future, to put it pretty simply, and only if the individual has robust diachronic psychological connectedness. So that's just to build the only if into the psychological connectedness condition into DTBD. I mean, there are other theories that you could connect this condition into, but at the very least, the objection here is saying that DTBD needs to be qualified with a necessary condition involving psychological connectedness. So here's a way of thinking about it before we get to that slide. Let's get to my whiteboard, quote unquote whiteboard. So here we're thinking about DTBD. So before we get into the psychological connectedness stuff, here's our chart. Someone comes into existence here, and their life just continues to go well for them, slow and steady climb, and then they die, a pretty quick death at say 60. Had they not died at 60, let's just stipulate that this individual lived to 100. the way I set things up before, remember the dip is to be accounted for the fact that they took, they took Phil 331 at 60. It's a non-traditional student, let's just say. And then things took off and got better. Then they died at 100. The thought here, remember, for DTBD, just generally, is just that the individual who dies here, who died at 60, would have lived to 100 and would have had all this well-being. They're deprived of all this well-being. They're deprived of a good life. Well, if McMahon is right, if the person who pushes the psychological connectedness condition is right, then we come here and we think about this individual who died at 60. We can imagine there being robust psychological connections or connectedness, right, over time. So this is a diachronic claim. So you might ask, well, what does it mean to have robust psychological connectedness over time? Well, things like a kind of consistency in the memories, the core base of beliefs and desires and values and these kinds of things. This person at 30, looking back and remembering being 5, and remembering various things about being 5 and being 10, being 20 and being 30. This person being able to tell, right, a story of his life that's roughly accurate to what happened in that life. Okay. These are all things that would demonstrate, right, provide evidence that there's robust psychological connectedness. What might break psychological connectedness? Well, perhaps mental illnesses. Perhaps someone coming of age in the early 20s, where oftentimes happens where someone has psychotic breaks. That could be something that leads to issues with psychological connectedness. Or it could be that someone ends up with a significant brain injury. And the brain injury leads to significant loss of memory, amnesia, even, serious cases of amnesia. Or just other maybe traumatic events. So if it's not a brain injury, some other, traumatic event that leads to serious case of PTSD, which in turn leads to, changes in values, significant changes in values. Okay, belief system changes, right? Completely new desire sets forming for things. So there's all kinds of things that can play a role in disturbing the psychological connections that we have over time. Okay, and to introduce something here that might be worth noting, it's oftentimes claimed that what makes someone the same person over time is going to be understood in terms of psychological connectedness. So sometimes we understand person more thinly, if I can put it that way, where we just mean something like, human being, where human being is understood maybe in the biological sense. So a baby is a person, a toddler is a person, a 10-year-old is a person, a 20-year-old is a person, an 80-year-old is a person, etc. So any human being, any individual who's a member of the species Homo sapiens is going to count as a person, and it's sort of like this biological sense of person that we oftentimes use in ordinary language, ordinary conversation. But then there's another sense of person, which, at least in the philosophical literature and elsewhere, is more psychological. So it's not as biological. So you might think there's a biological sense of person, but there's also a psychological sense of person that we use in different contexts. And the psychological notion of a person is sometimes or perhaps often associated with being not just conscious or having conscious awareness, but having a kind of self-consciousness or robust self-consciousness, a reflectiveness. Um, Sometimes built into it is at least a minimal, at the very least, a minimal sense of responsibility or, or having the property of being responsible for what one says, what one does. So there's different ways that this psychological sense of person will get fleshed out. So a kind of robust self-awareness, a kind of responsibility for um, one's behavior generally. And usually what's associated with self-awareness and responsibility is being rational, right? So you think that in order to be responsible, even in a minimal sense for what you do, um, you have to be like responsive enough to reasons, right? You're gonna be responsible when someone can say to you, well, you should have had this reason for doing what you did, right? As opposed to whatever reason one had when one acted. So all this is just really to say that some people, when they discuss this notion of psychological connectedness, they're interested in this idea of personal identity over time. And so we would say something like, um, looking here at my sketch here, my scribblings here on this whiteboard that I took a picture of, you know, um, take this red stick figure, this other red stick figure to just given the fact that they're the same, color, that they're the same person. And the sameness of person can be fleshed out in terms of robustness of psychological connectedness. But then once we start seeing sort of fissures and cracks in the connectedness, then if the crack is large enough, we might be inclined to say that we have a different person, right? Once we, now let this blue stick figure represent someone on, the same sort of maybe organism, biological organisms. It's the same life, as it were, but the psychology's changed so much that we'd say, this is a different person. Now, one could just skip talk of, person altogether here and say, no, we just mean it metaphorically that there's a different person here. What's really important is the psychological connections, even if these are the same, people. This is the same. This is the same person as this. So, so that's the significance of this discussion of robust psychological connectedness. And now, according to the psychological connectedness problem, it's going to matter how robust the psychological connections are across time, whether or not death is bad for the individual who dies. So here, let's suppose that, just to maybe drive home the point in the concrete case, let's suppose that this individual we have got charted here, who would have lived to 100 if he hadn't died at 60, let's suppose that from 0 to 60, there's robust psychological connections. At 60, this individual remembers being 5 and um, has significant overlap in the value system that he or she was raised with, came to believe in the early 20s, and all the rest. Has significant sets of overlapping desires across time, and all the things that provide us with robust psychological connections over time, usually. So let's suppose that that's so in this case. And then at 60, this individual dies. And he dies because he was um, hit over the head really hard or something like that. He had severe brain damage occur that led to his death. And the death was swift. So it was brain trauma. Suppose that that hadn't happened and that he survived through um, some form of surgery, some form of immediate surgery that he didn't get, for example, that if he had gotten that surgery, he was too far from the hospital when the accident happened or whatever. Um, right then, he would have survived, or there would have been continued existence at the very least, right, of this life. And there's a little dip here, might say, because of the, if he had had the surgery, there had been some difficulties that he went through. Obviously, he experienced severe, serious pain. But suppose what comes with sort of bodily survival here, life survival here, is that this individual ends up getting amnesia and radically changes psychologically in all the relevant ways that we've talked about. So there's weak psychological connectedness, or you might even say minimal psychological connectedness. Same brain and all the rest, but just the way the brain was damaged has altered the psychology of the individual greatly. But after the after the surgeries and discomfort and all the rest, things take off again, and there's a continued gradual good life that occurs thereafter. It's just that this individual doesn't remember being 5, doesn't remember being 10, doesn't remember being 20, doesn't remember even being 60, doesn't remember even, right? Doesn't remember these things. Like if this individual would have survived, right? Wouldn't even remember the event that led to hospitalization, the surgery, and the like. So, given that there's weak psychological connections here, according to the psychological connectedness condition and and views of the badness of death that require that we include such connectedness, they would claim that death isn't bad for this individual. Okay, just because of the fact that there's weak psychological connectedness. But if it turns out that that the connections would have remained robust enough, then all things being equal, right, good future was promised or predicted, then death would be bad for this individual. So some of these theorists might say that the reason why death isn't bad for this person, right, in this scenario that we've sketched, is because the person who would have lived, were the surgery performed and continued life happened, right? I'd be really just a different person. They might go that far. So there actually is a different person there, because they understand personhood in terms of these psychological properties. So they might even say, this is just a different person here. So that's why death isn't bad for this individual, because the injury was enough for this individual to go out of existence, such that were the life to have continued, the same person wouldn't have come out the other end, as it were. So that's a way of thinking about the psychological connectedness problem. Okay, so let's consider McMahon's fatal disease case. So this is a case that's supposed to help us see the intuitiveness of the significance of psychological connectedness to the badness of death for the individual that dies. So SEMA has a disease. So the SEMA case, so this is just me giving a name to the case. I think Bradley may have used a different example. It may have been just the reader. I can't remember who the example was, but I just used SEMA just to give the person a name. So SEMA has a disease that will kill her painlessly in 5 years' time if left untreated. SEMA will enjoy 5 good years. Okay, and then she'll die painlessly. Or SEMA can receive a treatment that will give her 20 more happy years to live, but the treatment will radically alter SEMA psychology. So I use the case when I was discussing the sketched case on this picture of the whiteboard of some trauma, some physical trauma happening to the brain of the individual. So here, similar kind of case, it just involves SEMA and SEMA having a disease. And then there's this additional bit where the disease will ultimately kill her in 5 years, but she'll have 5 years that are plenty worth living. But if she does, receive the treatment, again, according to the case here, then she'll have 20 more happy years to live. But for whatever reason, the treatment is going to radically alter SEMA psychology. And radically alter the SEMA psychology such that she doesn't remember her past self. She doesn't remember her past self well enough. Her beliefs, desires, her values radically change. Okay. Maybe the treatment will involve some kind of invasive transformation of the brain or something like that then leads to these psychology differences. And keep in mind that it's even those who work in this area, the idea of psychological connectedness over time is going to admit of vagueness. Right? It's really, there's really kind of like there's a spectrum, as it were, right, of connection, of how close the connections are, and it's going to be perhaps impossible to specify exactly when we got the break, right, in the psychological connections that are going to matter. So there's probably going to be vague boundaries, right, on either side. So we just try to think of clear cases and go from there. So McMahon wants to say that it makes sense for SEMA to deny the treatment, to go on living the 5 years that are going to be well worth living, and then for her to then painlessly die, as opposed to getting the treatment that will radically alter her psychology, which would then give her 20 more happy years to live. And the reason for that is just because she's going to be so psychologically disconnected from her past self that in a sense she'll be unrecognizable to herself these later stages. So enjoy the 5 years and let that be it. Now, McMahon and others, they could go as far as to say that SEMA will recognize that she'll actually go out of existence and some other person will come into existence by the end of the 20 years. That's one possibility. Okay, McMahon doesn't go that far, but that's because he has an interesting take on what it means to be a person and whether or not that's even important. Okay. So McMahon's case seems to do better than Bradley's in thinking about cases of deaths of fetuses compared to those of young adults. So even if you don't agree with McMahon in his fatal disease cases, we'll call it, there still might be problems with DTBD, with Bradley's DTBD theory, when thinking about how McMahon's cases fare in cases where we're thinking about the deaths of fetuses compared to deaths of young adults. So here, remember, DTBD, as we've been talking about it, has been, just a tad bit imprecise for the sake of just being able to talk about it quickly. So it's been a convenience, really. So as we've been talking about it, the DTBD is just a view that death is bad for the individual that dies, if and only if death deprives that individual of the valuable future, the good future that the individual would have had she not died. But remember, the view also involves the claim that there are degrees of badness of death for the individual that dies. So death is bad for the individual that dies to the extent that that individual is deprived of like the goods of life or something like that, to the extent that death robs the individual of the goods of life that the individual would have had or the individual not to have died. So then it looks like if that's right, then according to DTBD, death is worse for a fetus compared to that of a young adult, because the fetus is going to miss out on more goodness, all things being equal, than a young adult will, because, well, the fetus is younger, has longer to live, again, all things being equal, than the young adult has to live. So it looks like DTBD generally gets the wrong result in these kinds of cases, but McMahon's doesn't, because McMahon can say, look, the fetus, given the psychological development that a fetus has, given the psychological states that a fetus has, compared to the psychological states of a young adult, well, there's not going to be the relevant kind of psychological connections between the fetuses and later individuals, later persons that form from the fetus. At some point or other, fetuses become persons. Some do want to say that fetuses are persons from conception, but just that those views aside, at some point fetuses become psychologically robust, as we understand persons in the psychological sense of person. The thought here is just that, according to McMahon, death isn't going to be bad for fetuses or as bad for fetuses because they're not psychologically connected to their later persons, the persons that the fetuses became at some point or other in their development. But a young adult, all things being equal, is going to be a person, is going to have a robustly developed psychology, and death will be, all things being equal, bad for them, because they're, all things being equal, again, they're going to be psychologically connected to, right, those individuals that would have existed, right, were they not to have died. Right, they're going to be the same people. They're in the psychological sense, they're going to have the strong psychological connections to their future selves. The same is not true for a fetus. So McMahon seems to do better on this front. And Bradley says the deprivation theorist, the DTBD theorist, has to bite the bullet here and say that, yeah, death is worse for the fetus compared to that of young adults, for example. But then they'll have to supplement their theory to say, look, we should care more about the death of young adults because young adults have a greater moral status or some such. So, that's one move, is just to bite the bullet here. And Bradley's willing to do that, and I think that the DTBD theorist needs to do that, insofar as they want to keep their deprivation theory as general as it is. Okay, more could be said about that, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so Bradley, he ends up claiming, and this isn't going to be too helpful, but he ends up claiming that McMahon's view entails that the timing of the harming event makes an important difference in determining whether misfortune has been suffered, right, for the individual who suffers the relevant misfortune. But then Bradley doesn't say much more here. He just gives us a footnote that cites another philosopher's discussion of this topic, even though he discusses it as well in other places. So we'll leave it at that as well. He could have said more, he could have fleshed this out, but he doesn't in his paper, so I'll leave it alone at this point. Okay, so we've dealt with the 4 objections, the 4 problems, and Bradley's responses to them. Now let's think about judgments about death and judgments about well-being. So consider the deprivation theory, the badness of death. And suppose we have a choice between saving turtle and saving human. So I'm just giving them names. Bradley says, consider the choice of saving a turtle versus that of human. What does DTBD predict? We'll have to build more into turtle and human here. So following Bradley, let's go to the Bradley. So what he's going to do is create a little bit of a twist. We're thinking about turtle versus human. Okay, here we go. Yeah, right. So for example, so this is just the very beginning of section 2 of his paper. Suppose you must choose whether to save the life of a human or the life of a non-human animal. Suppose nothing else about the situation, you might think or knowing nothing else about the situation, you might think that you should save the life of the human. That seems pretty clear. Let's stipulate that the human is not Hitler or anything remotely as evil as Hitler. But suppose that the non-human is a young turtle that would live 100 years if it were saved, while the human is middle-aged human and would not live even half that long. So it would live maybe 30, 40 years, but certainly not 50 more years. You might think that doesn't matter. The human is still the one that should be saved. What should make this so? So the thought here is just very generally with respect to DTBD, the deprivation theory, the badness of death, the general version that Bradley wants to support. It looks like what we should do is save turtle, right? Right, insofar as the badness of death for the individual that dies, or individual is used very generically, plays a role in determining who we should save or what we should save. So it might be that DTBD predicts flat-footedly at first glance that we should save turtle and not human. That seems to be the wrong result. So DTBD looks like it's in some trouble. Bradley says, no worries. Perhaps we have special moral obligations to members of our own species, obligations of partiality, such as we might have towards family members. So he's trying to give a way out for the DTBD theorist. So the DTBD theorist might not be stuck with saying that all things being equal, or they might not be stuck saying that because the badness of death is a crucial determinant in whose life we save, right? There is a way that they can say that saving the human or saving human is preferable to saving turtle, even if one is a DTBD theorist. We do tend to think that we have obligations of partiality, obligations to those who are like closest to, and these like maybe special relationships then ground special obligations that we have, the way that parents have special obligations to their children, given that special close relationship that they have, the way siblings have special relationships to each other, the virtue of those close familial relationships. Or perhaps humans have greater inherent moral status than turtles do, due to our greater cognitive sophistication. So we have an obligation to save a human rather than a turtle, even if we could benefit the turtle more by saving it. Okay, and here what Bradley's doing is he's canvassing possibilities, and then he says perhaps even though the human would live a shorter life if saved, her death, shorter than the turtle's life. Her death is a greater misfortune than the turtle's. And then Bradley, he notes, it would be difficult to maintain such a position if, for example, some simple version of hedonism were true, where all that matters are pleasant experiences, and the turtle, because the turtle's going to live longer, is going to have more pleasant experiences than the human would have. Supposing that's like possible, like in logical space. So long as the turtle gets a reasonable amount of pleasure in life and generally avoids pain, its life would be much longer than it would, that it would accumulate higher hedonic balance than the human could. This might lead us to reject simple hedonism, so that we might go for a higher lower pleasure distinction, a la John Stuart Mill, who we've talked about earlier in the term. Pleasures of art using intellectual activity are what are pleasures that we can experience. Okay, in that case, you're strictly speaking, perhaps developing an anti-hedonistic view, going as hedonism. And so then, but that might be okay, because then that might allow for, right, claiming that might allow the DTBD theorists to say, look, the death of the human is worse than the death of the turtle. Okay, so those are all things that the DTBD theorists can say to avoid the implication that that saving a turtle would be better than saving human, because turtle's death would be worse for it than human's death. Okay. Now consider DTBD again. We ask which is preferable. Which death is preferable? One that a death that involves an ending where the life was going great and then there's sort of a sudden stop. That's what I meant to include here. So which death is preferable? One whose life ends while life is going great, right? So, whoop, I don't want all caps lock there. And then, or a life that ends after life was going great, but now is just fair. Right, there we go. So you might ask, what's the difference between these two? Well, the main difference is just that you kind of might imagine the lives were the same. They were going really, really, really good. I mean, things were going really, really great. With the first one, then you have like a really quick death, and that's it. So the life ended with a death where the life was just going just so great. And the next one, you might imagine the same exact sort of trajectory in the life. But then what ends up happening is just things drop down to a kind of fair to middling for a couple of years, and then death. Okay. Now, all things being equal, the second life that we described is going to have more goodness in it, right? Even though the last 2 years are just going to be fair with respect to well-being levels, right? For the individual. So then which death is preferable? And Bradley notes here is that many claim that the first death is preferable. Okay. So it's like, maybe it's like a matter of like empirical fact, like when people have been asked to choose between these two lives, many have chosen the life that involves an ending where it was precipitous, but the life was at its climax just before the end, just before its precipitous decline, compared to the other life. Okay, so it looks like this kind of, it looks like if it's right that um, this death is preferable to, or the first death is preferable to the second death, then DTBD is in trouble. And the reason for this, at least based on Bradley's discussion of it, is that some argue that lifetime well-being is more than just like an additive matter, where what we do is we just think about stacking on moments of well-being or momentary well-being until we have the lifetime well-being. Remember, a way of understanding DTBD is in terms of lifetime well-being levels being adversely affected by death. And lifetime well-being could be understood additively, where all we do is we just stack on the moments. They just add up to the lifetime well-being level, and that's it. But some claim that there's another dimension to lifetime well-being. And that dimension is the narrative structure. The narrative structure of the life, as it were. Maybe a way of putting it is the way in which the ways in which even the momentary well-being levels are distributed, right, throughout a life. And so philosophers like Velleman offer the following as support for there being a narrative component to lifetime well-being levels, as opposed just to the merely additive component. And when we compare two lives that are exactly the same in terms of lifetime well-being levels, when we just think about additive well-being, but one life is just continually good, right? Just continues to get better and better and better and better. And then death happens, say, precipitously. We compare that with a life where things start off just amazing, but just slowly but surely, gradually end in death. We can imagine those having exactly the same amounts of well-being. But according to philosophers like Velleman, the first life is preferable to the second life because the first life just kept getting better and better and better. It had a better narrative structure compared to the second life, which had exactly the same amount of well-being. It's just that life just continued to get worse and worse and worse and worse for the individual until it culminated in death. So this view is supposed to challenge the deprivation, just very simple, straightforward, generic theories of the deprivation theory, the badness of death, which only think about additive well-being. And Bradley basically leaves it at that and just says this is a challenge that the deprivation theorists would have to respond to. Josh, I really wanted to talk about Bradley's paper on death being bad for a cow, and one of the reasons I want to talk about it is because there's some overlap in what he discusses in that paper and what he discusses here. So it would have been cool to see the application of much of what was talked about here in a discussion of the issue of whether or not death is bad for a cow. And as I think I anticipated last time, Bradley does think death is bad for cows. And he deals really with a range of objections that are similar to the ones that were developed here. Many would argue that death isn't bad for cows because they don't have the relevant, robust desires, they don't have the psychological connectedness over time and the like. And Bradley gives similar kinds of responses in that paper that as he gave here in this paper defending DTBD. Okay, so looks like I've gone over a little bit, so I should probably stop here. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns about anything? Okay, then I'll go ahead and stop sharing. I have office hours in a few minutes, so feel free to stop on by. If not, then have a great rest of your Thursday. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.